Go Get Mommy's Bra is the 4th episode of the 2nd season of 2.5 Men. It's directed by Pamela Fryman, and it's very, very funny. I love this episode, and there will be spoilers from now as I talk about various things that I found to be pretty entertaining. I don't know if I'd say it's one of my all-time favourite episodes, but it could be a contender for an all-time favourite from season 2. And it starts off brilliantly. We get a lot of Jake in this. I always seem to really love the episodes where we have a lot of Jake. I just think he's a brilliant character. And it starts off with Jake with his head in the sink, wearing a snorkel. And it takes us a couple of minutes to establish why this is. And this is because Dr. Melnick has told Jake he'll teach him how to scuba dive once he learns to snorkel, which is pretty cool, and it establishes the message for the entire episode. And that's that Jake has this really cool guy in his life, and there are various feelings that different characters have throughout this, and we'll unpack those feelings as we go through it. And what's worth noting is that Dr. Melnick is still called Greg at this point. They do change his name to Herb further down the line, but I won't talk about that in any detail here, but he is still called Greg, so if I refer to him as Greg, that is why. Evelyn comes over a little later, and Evelyn's in it a decent amount as well, which is always really great, and she wants to borrow Charlie's Mercedes because she's trying to sell this house, and I found this to be very funny because Charlie is saying, no way, not a chance. Evelyn says, I won't leave until you say yes. And obviously, immediately, Charlie gives her the keys. And I think it's clear at this point that something will happen as a result of Evelyn having the keys to the car. But it might not be obvious yet. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Meanwhile, Charlie is driving Evelyn's car, and it's an electric car, which Alan describes as futuristic, which, watching this in 2024, kind of funny. And Jake had a great point. What happens if there's a power outage and you can't charge your car? I don't have an answer to that, but if anybody knows what would happen if there's an electricity outage, can you just not charge the car? Is that it? As simple as you can't drive? I don't know what's going to happen when everything's fully electric and that happens. But either way, Jake's not that impressed. Greg has a Hummer. And Charlie decides to do something not really for Jake's benefit, but for Alan's benefit. And Charlie really supports everybody in this episode, which I think is really lovely. And he decides to tell Jake he can learn to drive the car. And initially, Alan says no, but then Charlie reminds him that it's Evelyn's car they're driving, so why not? And we have this brilliant performance for all three of them when they're trying to drive this car, and just the way they move about with the car, theoretically thrashing them about, I just thought was brilliantly done and very, very entertaining, and I rather enjoyed it. And it seems like Jake really liked it too. Alan then drops Jake off back home with Judith, and Judith tells Alan that she's no longer seeing Greg. And Alan does a brilliant dance, which Judith sees through the peephole, which I thought was brilliantly done. I just found this episode to be so funny. Everything that happened was so entertaining. And before we learn about the breakup in more detail, we learn something that chills Alan to the core, because Charlie comes into the room and he's got his own car back, and he comes in with a bra, and he tells Alan he found this in his car, and Alan says this line that I love, because he says, I'd like to meet the lady who fills this. And we, the viewer, based partly on the title, but also because it's kind of obvious, we know who it belongs to. And Charlie has a bit of fun with this. I like that he didn't reveal it straight away. And Alan's response once he learns that it's Evelyn's bra, his mother's, absolutely fantastic. And then things get maybe a little emotional, certainly if it's an element of relatability, because Jake phones up Alan, and he's learned about Greg and Judith no longer being together, and he's heartbroken, he's angry at his mother, even though we learn that actually it's not his mother's fault. But what this suggests, and I think this is a really positive thing for Judith, because Jake is blaming his mother, that suggests that Judith hasn't resorted to blaming Greg. We learn that Greg didn't want to be with her anymore. Judith's actually devastated, but she doesn't badmouth Greg to Jake. And I think that that's a really positive thing for her to do, and very telling about how she's not willing to badmouth people who Jake cares about just because she can. And I think that that's brilliant. So well done to Judith for that. But obviously that doesn't make Jake feel any better. And Evelyn comes over very briefly, and I don't know what Charlie was expecting when he produced Evelyn's bra from his trouser pocket or his shorts pocket. I don't know what he thought she was going to think to see her son just producing her underwear. It's bizarre. And when she said it was sick, I thought, yeah, that's exactly what that looks like, but very, very funny for a viewer. And then Judith comes over with Jake, and Charlie, as I said, Charlie's really wonderful and supportive in this episode. He decides to take Jake out so Judith and Alan can talk, and Judith really opens up to Alan, and she becomes very emotional. Meanwhile, Charlie and Jake are having a really lovely heart-to-heart, and it's actually really sweet and really moving, and Charlie's also buying a new car, which I thought was, not unexpected. And then cut back to Alan and Judith, and in Judith's vulnerable state. And I feel like Alan was maybe not intentionally taking advantage of Judith at this point, but he should have really recognised that Judith was vulnerable and that he shouldn't have allowed himself to kiss her passionately as he did and pick her up. And yes, he's trying to make her feel better, but at the same time, she's vulnerable. She's not thinking clearly. This is not something that she's going to feel happy about once the emotions begin to subside. But we do get some comedy out of it, of course, as Charlie and Jake walk in at that moment, and Alan, in his shock, just drops Judith on the floor. And then we have the final scene, which I thought was actually really funny and really telling about how Jake views his parents as a couple, because Alan is refusing to tell Jake the truth about what he saw, and Charlie just tells him the truth that they were going to have sex, and Jake immediately says, no way, because as he sees his parents, they're constantly fighting and bickering, and they don't get on well, and there's no way they'd ever do anything like that, because they hate each other. That is actually quite upsetting, because that means his parents are not making enough of an effort around him to be amicable, and that's not great. But that aside, very funny, very entertaining episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Go Get Mummy's Bra is very strong. I laughed pretty much all of the way through it. And as I said, it could be a contender for a favourite from season 2. It is pretty fantastic. And if I were to pick personal highlights, I'd probably struggle. But I think the driving lesson and obviously Evelyn, when she came to get the bra, and the fact that she just decided there's no point in beating around the bush. I thought that was brilliant. Also loved the outfit she was wearing at that point. Very appealing. Just the whole thing. Absolutely fantastic. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Go Get Mummy's Bra is a brilliant 2.5 Men episode.